All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you all for being here today. Today is webinar 7, Livestock Integration and Agroforestry. Today's February 6th as well. Want to, as usual, thank the Lake Champlain Basin Program and NUIPIC for the funding to create and host this soil health training program. And for our agendas today, we're actually going to do things a little bit different. We'll do the course overview, and then I'm actually going to give a brief presentation on livestock integration. Our guests today had a little bit of other things going on, so Eli Roberts will be joining us, I believe around 2:30 for the agroforestry presentation representing Interlace Commons. I figured I'd start out the day with a little livestock integration presentation. As usual, the course overview. Where are we in this fun journey together? We are smack dab in the middle of part 2. How do we manage for soil health? And next week we'll have managing for water and soil structure from Joshua Faulkner. Alrighty. I'm gonna dive in with some livestock integration, and I just want to do a big disclaimer that this content was almost entirely sourced from Building Soils for Better Crops, Chapter 12, Integrating Crops and Livestock from Magdoff and Van S. I want to do a quick shout out to Dorothy Kinney-Landis on our team, who created a great presentation and presented it last week as part of a webinar called Why Farmers Spread Manure. I'm going to toss that link in the chat for everyone. Please check it out as you have time. It has a lot more Vermont-specific info about the rules and regulations around manure. We're still updating the subtitles for that video, but we did want to get it posted on YouTube so it could be a resource for those who could access it in this form. But stay tuned for more information once the subtitles do become available as well. Alrighty. And so first things first, when it comes to integrating livestock, diversity is good. I know we've been saying this in a lot of different presentations, but want to really reiterate it here. Animal operations, so when crops are fed to animals, most nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium contained in the feeds are excreted as waste products. Therefore, when animal products are the main sales from the farm, relatively few nutrients relative to what the animals ate leave the farm. Whereas with crop operations, farms that exclusively produce annual grain crops, such as corn, soybeans, wheat, and sorghum, or even vegetables, they export a lot of nutrients contained in their crops. They also have no reason to include perennial forage crops in their rotations, though some do, because it usually requires additional equipment and can be a really bulky part of their operation. And so exclusively growing annuals, especially only 1 or 2 crops, makes weed control more challenging, deprives the land of the improved soil health of multi-year grasses and legumes, allows disease and insect pests to flourish, and requires large amounts of nitrogen fertilizer to be applied for most crops. So when you add them together, you get these integrated systems. And so it's integrating livestock into the farm operation, which can make it more sustainable and also makes it more complex. If it's not implemented in the right way, it can also increase environmental problems. So do just want to give a little bit of a disclaimer there. This slide is really just saying exactly what's on the slide. Grazing promotes healthy soils. So it combines 3 different beneficial practices of perennial forage crops, minimized tillage, and regular manure addition. So really adding in that diversity from animals into a crop landscape. There was a soil health study involving a wide range of New York cropping systems that confirmed that pasture fields had far better soil health scores in a number of different metrics. Many of these metrics that Lindsay talked about when she was going over the CASH soil health test a couple weeks ago. And so when we're talking about grazing, there's kind of 3 different areas. Animals graze in pastures, which are typically grass-based, and so animals graze their own feed on the land, which is most appropriate for ruminant animals. And non-ruminants like chickens and pigs can still graze in pastures, but they typically need additional feed. Can also graze on marginal lands. So think about the sheep in Vermont in the 1800s when we deforested most of the hillsides and let the small ruminants roam around and feed themselves. And then also as part of integrated crop livestock systems, which typically involve annual crops. So I'm going to talk about low management grazing, or as some people might rather refer to it as poor grazing management. Some folks are and have been practicing continuous grazing, where they will let their animals out into a large area for a long period of time, potentially the entire grazing season. Some other farmers might use what's called night pastures, which is where the dairy cows who are finished milking, they go back out into just a couple of pastures, usually right around the barn, and those can often get really overgrazed. And so some of the impacts from this low management grazing approach include continual grazing, which results in weak plants and poor forage quality. And this is because plants need to grow to a reasonable size before the root reserves can be fully replenished. And continual regrazing of early shoot regrowth depletes root reserves, making it harder for the plant to regrow again after grazing. And then there's obviously the risk of overgrazing as well, which happens when farmers maintain excessive herd sizes, often based on normal or good growing conditions during years that experience low rainfall. So even if you have a system that's supposed to work for you, if the weather is changing the conditions of that field or that pasture, you really need to adjust. And this can cause excessive foraging, weakening, or die off of the pasture plants, and subsequently soil degradation and further loss of productivity. So if we're not doing low management, we're probably doing improved grazing management. And these two practices occur in typical pastures. And so the first one I want to talk about is management intensive grazing. And this is where animals are rotated through many pastures and do not regraze a paddock until plants have sufficiently regrown. Depending on the season and the weather, the rotation cycle can be as short as a week or 10 days and as long as 6 to 8 weeks. For dairy farms using this practice, cows are typically turned out onto a fresh paddock after each milking. Other animals might be moved to a new pasture daily or every few days. And this practice has shown great improvement in pasture productivity and animal health, and it's efficient because harvesting and fertilization require no or limited equipment and human labor. There's also mob grazing, which is when extremely high stocking densities, 100,000 pounds of animals per acre, are used for very short time periods, typically 8 to 12 hours. And this approach is used as a soil amelioration technique, where animals suppress or kill poor quality plant species, and with their hooves, they help to reseed the paddock with more productive species. In some situations, animals are allowed to roam over larger rangeland areas, but are stocked densely during the nighttime. And so the carbon, nutrients, and seeds gathered during the day are excreted into the smaller area and provide a significant boost for soil fertility and revegetation. Peter, I just saw your comment in the chat. I think your next band should be named Mob Grazing. I like it. There's also improved grazing management practices in integrated crop livestock systems. And so again, this is when you have more annual crops than a traditional perennial pasture system is kind of the differentiation we're making here. And so there's 4 practices that we're going to talk about, including grazing of annual crop residue. So in an annual row crop system where the grain is harvested and the residues are grazed during the dormant periods in the autumn, winter, or dry season. In some cases, farmers also leave some of the grain unharvested, corn or sunflowers, for example, enabling forage access for the grazing animals during the winter, even in deep snow, and then the next one is swath grazing, which you can see in the photo Figure 12.5 taken again directly from Magdoff and Van Es. So this includes annual crops such as barley and triticale, which are cut in autumn and left in swaths or heaped rows for grazing. This is typically done for beef cattle. So grazing is typically controlled through temporary fencing, and swath grazing improves forage accessibility, especially when there is deep snow, by concentrating and stacking the forage into narrow swaths so that animals can still reach it even above the snow. There's also grazing of annual forages or cover crops. So annual or short season crops, which can also function as cover crops, are involved in this system. And there's a couple different options here. There's cool season crops like winter wheat, rye, or triticale, which can be planted in the fall for spring grazing or planted in the spring. Plants including oats, barley, and wheat for late spring and early summer grazing. There's also brassicas like turnips, kale, and legumes, such as forage peas that are often mixed in. There's warm season annual grasses like sorghum, sorghum Sudan grass, and millet that can be planted in the late spring to provide autumn grazing. And these systems can be matched with the cash crops after grazing. So controlled grazing of the cover crops can significantly contribute to high quality forage and can be used as a means to terminate a cover crop. And then lastly on this screen, grazing perennial forage crops that are part of a crop rotation on an integrated crop livestock farm. This is really when you have an annual crop, perennial crop rotation, so a corn grass rotation, meaning that you're raising forages usually for 2 to 10 years that can be either hayed or grazed. So one of the great advantages of an integrated crop livestock farm is that they provide a very good reason for growing perennial forages, which considerably enhance soil health, as we've discussed throughout this entire process. So, grazing pros and cons. Why not to graze? The argument is often made that animals on pastures expend more of their energy on foraging compared to confined animals, thus reducing meat or milk yields. And there's also another argument that the most productive biomass crops, like corn and sorghum, don't lend themselves very well to grazing. And those are good arguments. It's my understanding from my reading that in most cases, cows grazing on high quality, intensively managed pastures result in lower cost of production once you factor in the lower labor and machinery needs for such tasks as cleaning barns, spreading manure, harvesting crops, transporting animals to barns, and cleaning them out. Additionally, the use of newer styles of fencing and electric fence chargers do make it easy to quickly set up new grazing paddocks. Once dairy or beef cows are trained to electric fences, a single strand electric internal fence is usually enough to contain them in the paddock. There's also the fancy new collars with GPS that I don't know enough about, but I think are really cool and probably help a lot with that labor cost. And so grazing is great. Let's graze. Wish we could graze all the time, but we're in Vermont, so we can't just graze. The images on the screen are obviously a flooded field, which, happens every so often in Vermont these days, or a snowy field, which happens usually every year, even though this year doesn't seem as likely, depending on where you are. And so you really need to be able to bring the animals inside and manage their wastes as well. Because full reliance on pastures to provide all of the animals' forage needs is generally not feasible. Pastures experience periods of limited growth during dry or cold seasons, and additional feed is needed. In many cases, baled hay has to be supplied from other sources, and most animals also require additional grain for optimal growth. So once they're inside, they still are pooping, and so we got to manage their manure. Just going through some of the different types of manure. And again, I know many of you know this already, but just trying to make sure we're all on the same page here. Manures can really vary based on animal species, age, bedding, feed, handling, and the manure storage practices. And so in dairy manure handling systems, the type of barn typically determines how that manure is handled. And so you'll get solid manure typically in a tie stall or individual stanchion barn, which requires a high amount of bedding and leads to about 20% dry matter or more in the manure. In a freestall barn, you'll typically get a liquid manure because it has minimal bedding, and that results in about a 2 to 12% dry matter manure. And then in between there's the semi-solid of the 12 to 20% dry matter. And then there's also these composted manure systems now, often found in a bedded pack barn. And so they're set up like a freestall barn where bedding and manure build up over the winter, and then the pack is cleaned out later, either in the spring and then out in windrows or directly applied, or in the fall before the animals go back in. The composting helps stabilize nutrients, although a considerable amount of ammonium is usually lost in the process. Composting also reduces the volume of the material and reduces odors. So typically when you're spreading it, you're spreading less and it's not as stinky for your neighbors. Some farmers also separate the solids from liquid manure, and then they irrigate with the liquid and they compost the solids. Another bit of information is that poultry manure also varies by amount of bedding, and that's typically based on the production scale. So a broiler production often has a lot of bedding, and industrial scale egg production typically has little to no bedding. And so we've got all this manure. We have to store it, and then eventually we have to spread it. And so storage is a really great thing that exists because it allows the farmer the opportunity to spread the manure when it's best for the crop and during appropriate weather conditions. So we're really storing it to be able to use it at the right time. Storage conditions can also contribute to losses of things like nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, though. So the number of ways you store something can really impact the quality of that product in the end. And after you've stored it, you eventually have to spread it. And the amount of nutrients in manure that become available to crops really depends on the time of the year that the manure is applied and how quickly it is incorporated into the soil. Because half of the nitrogen and almost all of the phosphorus is in the solids of a manure, a higher proportion of these nutrients typically remain in the sediments at the bottom of a pit when a liquid system is emptied without properly agitating the manure. I know I have worked with many farmers who go to take a manure sample without properly agitating, and you're not really getting a representative sample of what they're spreading. So really trying to make sure that they have agitated the full pit and they are sampling what they are actually spreading is really important. And then I just thought this was a useful tool for folks who may not be as familiar with dairy farmers, but a common per acre rate of dairy manure application is 10 to 30 tons fresh weight of solid manure, or 4,000 to 11,000 gallons of liquid manure. And then you got to put the manure on the crop. So we're spreading our manure at the right time and working really hard to make sure that those nutrients are getting into the crop when they need them. So for annual crops, we're going to start with the spring. And so manures are best applied to annual crops such as corn, small grains, and vegetables in one dose just before soil tillage, unless a high amount of bedding is used, in which case that might tie up nitrogen for a while. And then you can also broadcast the manure, and so that's surface applying manure, which allows for rapid incorporation by plow, chisel, harrow, disc, or aerator, or just leaving it on the surface. And then there's also injection. And so if it's injected, you might not need any further tillage, but make sure that the application is close to the planting time because the possibility of loss by runoff and erosion is reduced. It's also possible to inject liquid manures either just before the growing season starts or as a side dressing to row crops. And just as a side note, injection of liquid manure sometimes causes problems when used on poorly drained soils in wet years. The extra water applied and the additional use of oxygen by microorganisms may mean less aeration for plant roots and the loss of readily plant available nitrate by denitrification. And then there's also fall manure, which is just important to be aware of. That fall manure applications on annual row crops such as corn may result in considerable nitrogen loss, even if the manure is incorporated. Fall applied manure in humid climates allows ammonium conversion to nitrate and then leaching and denitrification before nitrogen is available to the next year's crop. And then we get to perennial crops. So talking mostly about grasses here again. Without any added nitrogen, perennial grass hay crops are constantly nitrogen deficient. So you do need to be adding nitrogen back to these crops. The application of a moderate rate of manure, about 50 to 70 pounds worth of available nitrogen in the early spring and following each harvest is the best way to apply that manure. And spring applications may be at higher rates, but wet soils in early spring may not allow for manure application without causing significant compaction. And then I'm going to pause for a moment because I believe, Eli, have you joined us?
Can you hear me now?
I can. Hi, how are you?
Great.
Wonderful.
Good. Thanks for being flexible with this. Sorry, everyone, I was later than I thought I had to be.
Not a problem. Are you ready to go? I got a couple more slides if you're not, but if you're ready to go, we'll hand it off to you.
Yeah, I'm ready to go.
Perfect.
And it looks like I can share my screen now.
All right, well, I will introduce you then. I'll let you start sharing your screen. Great. And thanks everyone for bearing with me, trying to get you through some new information. And so I just want to introduce Eli. And so Eli Roberts is a technical service provider with Interlace Commons. He's a forester, farmer, and consultant focusing on ecological forest management and agroforestry systems, particularly interested in silvopasture and conservation biocontrol. He's helped forest landowners upgrade their management plans to enroll in NRCS programs and developed watershed-scale forest conservation strategies with NGOs. Eli has written a guide to managing forests in a changing climate and a book chapter on agroforestry for the Northeast. He attended Villanova and Yale for his degrees in psychology and forestry. He's been a teacher, social worker, gardener, project manager, and part-time chestnut orchardist. He also loves watching sheep eat leaves from a row of coppiced mulberries. With that, Eli, I will turn it over to you, and thank you very much for being here.
Great, thanks so much. Is my audio good?
Yes.
Volume-wise and clarity and stuff? Okay.
And the screen looks great as well.
Okay, awesome. Glad to hear it. Cool. Thanks, everyone. I'm gonna give my silvopasture talk with an emphasis on soil health, and let's get into it. So, the word silvopasture or silvopasture is one of many agroforestry practices. I like to say agroforestry is just useful trees on farms. You can use the fancier definition of combinations of trees that are with crops and livestock that are intentional, intensive, integrated, and interactive. However you categorize them, key points are there's a lot of variation. There's a long history, many hundreds and thousands of years of people all around the world involving trees in their agricultural systems. So we didn't invent this. It's not only about us. We're sort of we learn a lot from people throughout history and across the world. So you may have heard of alley cropping, rows of trees between rows of crops, riparian forest buffers, trees and streams, windbreaks to break the wind, and forest farming of growing herbs and mushrooms under a forest canopy. And so those are the kind of official USDA defined agroforestry practices. There's also hedge laying, hedge management, big in Europe, pollard and coppice management, which can be a component of forest management or some of these other things, and fodder banks, which we'll talk about later. So the point is that silvopasture as a practice exists within the bigger umbrella of agroforestry, useful trees on farms, and there's a lot of ways to do it. And I think that there's value in categorizing for clarity and kind of ease of comparing systems, but some of the boundaries between these things are fuzzy, and that's fine. So I'm not up here trying to say I'm here to police the boundaries between these different things. So silvopasture has three key ingredients: trees, forages, and rotating animals. I recently also added this fourth ingredient, which is people that are involved, because these systems don't operate without us. And we'll come back to this 3-point test for being able to call something a silvopasture. And let me just go back and say on that topic of definition, I want to come up with the definition of silvopasture that I'm using, not because I'm the ultimate authority on silvopasture, but so that you know what I'm talking about when I make these claims. You know, we're going to go through some sort of generalizable or universal things, and I want to set out what I'm talking about, because there's also a lot that is sort of on the edges of silvopasture practice, which is maybe more questionable on some of these things that we'll talk about. So for the purposes of this presentation, and I'll make the case to you that trees, forages, and rotating animals plus people with an active management role are what we're talking about here. And so silvopastures have these mixtures of trees, forages, and rotating animals, and they're about half shady. So you could get out your densiometer on the top left to measure the sunlight. If you've got forestry, you can get out an angle gauge and come up with a basal area proxy. This bottom picture, you could just sort of look and see, oh, that's about half. Or I like to think about the mixture of trees and grass as having these like functional guardrails, right? And then so there's sort of a range of how many trees are enough. Just one tree, I'm excluding from our discussion of silvopasture. Single trees are useful for other reasons, but because they concentrate animal impact, we don't get a lot of the same benefits that we would get in a silvopasture system with distributed trees. So the fewest number of trees that I'm calling a sort of good silvopasture is enough to provide these useful amounts of shade and enough to distribute the impact of the animals. Somewhere in the middle is this 20 to 200 trees, depending on how big they are. And then the top end of this is where there are so many trees that the grass doesn't grow well, at which point the system would fail our 3-point test of, are there trees, are there grasses, are there rotating animals? So I sort of think about that as these like functional guardrails, rather than saying, oh, this is what you should measure, although there are things to measure also. So to my point before, things that I'm not calling silvopasture here: a single tree, because they concentrate the animal impact; dense woods where there's no grass, which also fails the 3-point test of having forages available; an orchard where the cows spend many weeks at a time; or this one on the right where there's decent spacing, but they don't have the rotational element of the animal management. So you can see the dead trees on the right of that picture, which I'm guessing came from concentrating animals, especially during a wet period, which damaged those tree roots. Goats and pigs in the woods, there's maybe limited arguments for that. And I think that is often called silvopasture, but especially this sort of moonscape on the right side of the picture fails the 3-point test of trees, forages, and rotating animals. The colloquial sense of the term prescribed grazing, which is using animal impact to change the vegetation, is also not silvopasture, though you hear about these, goats in the woods projects, or goats eating weeds. I will say this note here: the NRCS practice prescribed grazing is compatible with silvopasture, because it talks about sort of rotating for feed availability and all kinds of stuff. So I'll distinguish those two things. This Venn diagram of the tree element, the grass element, and the rotating animals element kind of shows the things that are silvopasture adjacent and what I'm calling silvopasture. And ideally, when I'm working with farms, when we're talking to farms, people already have the grass and the rotating animals element, right? So that's we just call that good pasture management, and then adding the tree layer kind of pushes things into silvopasture. I think if you're missing any of these, and like that note says, that good grazing is a prerequisite to silvopasture. It's an essential component, and if you have good tree spacing without good grazing, it's not going to work well. Let's see. so this sort of big question of trees are cool, but they're also, you can't move them and you can't really control them. So this question, how can we make these trees improve things rather than make them harder? And I'm not saying, oh, we have these trees, we should plant them, not trees as a solution in search of a problem. So we think about using trees to address problems, much in the way that NRCS and others orient these conservation practices. Here's the NRCS practice itself, 381. There's much more in that practice standard, and the conservation practice effects are documented in their forms. Sometimes people ask, what kind of trees should I plant? What are the best silvopasture trees? And I like to go in the direction of figure out the function you want the trees to serve, figure out what matches well on the site, and then figure out what species match those criteria, rather than saying, oh, here's good silvopasture species, let's plant them in a place where they won't do what we want or where they might not be adapted. So that's the direction I like to go. So why bother? Why are we talking about this? Silvopastures can be useful for all of these things that you can see, and we'll go through some details about them one by one. Obviously, shade mitigates heat stress to some degree, and it depends on the animal, it depends on their time of the year or time of life cycle, whatever. But there is some threshold for every animal where extra heat and humidity reduces performance, so we can manage that. This is a spot I worked on in Orange County on the same day in August during our super drought, where I had full sun, part shade, and full shade conditions, and you can see the dramatic difference in surface temperatures. We know that the high temperatures are likely to keep rising. The number of very hot days is likely to keep going up, and the number of days with heavy rainfall events is at least going to stay as high as it is and potentially become more variable at least. So those are the conditions for which we're planning. One important thing is that you shouldn't put every inch of every farm in silvopasture. So trees, they keep the ground cooler during the day, but they can also stop the warm air from rising at night. So this was a study in Virginia that showed that the internal temp of heifers was cooler in the day, cooler in silvopastures during the day, but it was warmer than open pastures at night. So those are some dynamics that we want to remember. This is another study that compared temperatures on like a collar that cattle were wearing, and showed that silvopastures were cooler in between noon and 6 a.m., but that sort of cool morning period, there was no difference. So there's some nuance there. Partly shady conditions can increase protein, delay maturity of cool season grasses. They can delay fall senescence. And an interesting piece of this is that even when there's no measurable benefit to pasture, the animals do as well or better than an open pasture. And so this is interesting because there's air temperatures are not necessarily surface temperatures of the animal. Surface temperatures are not necessarily internal temps. And then depends on what they're eating. So there's a lot of moving pieces here. So it's not that there's like a direct link between each of these things, but it's sort of like silvopastures, this black box that we can control some of the elements of, and then animals tend to either do as well or better, depending. Let's see. This was an interesting study that compared the green is orchard grass, cool season grass, and the orange is warm season grasses. And then it showed productivity in both silvopasture and open pasture systems. So in this sampling in Arkansas, in early June, the silvopastures were more productive, but then by mid-June, the open warm season grasses were the most productive. So this kind of shows that transition from like the end of spring cool season grass season, where the silvopasture is delaying that maturity and sort of pushing that peak in productivity of cool season grasses later, at which point in this system where the warm season grasses could take over. So this is to say silvopastures can affect pasture quality and productivity, but it's variable. This is another look at how the amount of shade affects how productive the grass is. And you see this sort of sweet spot around 30%, where you can add 30% shade and not get a huge amount of productivity decline. So we're sort of looking at this 30, 40, 50% as a key number. Of course, trees help water to infiltrate well through their deep roots, through their leaf litter inputs, and that's well documented. This is one of the papers from the readings that compared all of these soil health indicators to comparable open pastures. And so this suggests that silvopastures experience less erosion and runoff, have about comparable porosity, and infiltrate water better. Although the paper that you read was focused on research in the humid and subhumid tropics. So, you keep your asterisk there. But there's that. This is a Virginia Tech, a paper from Virginia Tech that I think you also read, that showed a lot of the soil health parameters or soil properties were not statistically significant between silvopasture and open pasture, except organic matter in the honey locust block. And so this is interesting because if we think of silvopasture as a technique for intensifying production, right? Either adding services to enhance a enterprise or to be a separate enterprise. This is a way of adding more stuff onto an acre of land without compromising some of these soil health parameters. So again, there can be like benefits, or there can just be things won't get worse. These are just from two studies that showed phosphorus storage capacity in Florida, which showed that soil and silvopastures retained more phosphorus than open pastures. And then this other one that showed that as a tree buffer grew over time, it reduced the amount of sediment and other nutrients coming off. Another important thing about silvopasture is that it provides habitat, perching birds, especially for perches for birds, especially for those that land on a branch, fly out and catch a bug, and then come back to the branch to eat it. Nest sites and other habitat elements for other good bugs. Of course, carbon sequestration. Trees are made of carbon. The bigger they get, the more carbon they have. Trees can produce products, right? You see the picture is Chinese chestnuts in an alley cropping system with winter wheat. Trees make fruit, wood, nuts, and decorations, or fruit for the animals to eat. So that's one sort of flavor of silvopasture. But then also, you have to decide when you're thinking about a silvopasture system, they don't have to. So you might design it to produce a separate crop, as it says, like chestnuts, pears, or fence posts, or trees might just be there to provide services like shade or forage effects or any of these other things. And my note down there is that, if you grow chestnuts, that's great, but you don't make money on them until you sell them, until you process them and market them and sell them. And so there's just more to do when you take on a whole other enterprise. So it's worth, in the design phase, it's worth being very clear about what the goal of the silvopasture is and what the trees do. Also, just places with this mix of trees and grass are nice to spend time in. And so that's not the only reason one would do this, but it doesn't hurt. And I think especially for places that have a agritourism component, this is also an important element to think about. They're nice. This is a park and an arboretum. When I was looking at silvopasture, I thought, oh, this meets a lot of the parameters, except the good rotational grazing. So this big question, is it right for you or the people you work with? Not everywhere, of course. You need the right site, good infrastructure, and good management. It can be very useful. I would argue particularly in the face of hotter, drier, less predictable weather. But of course, this big question of matching the goals in the site context. Do you have the time and resources? It is more complicated to add a tree layer to pasture than to just manage the pasture itself. And so that might be a worthwhile trade-off, but it's not without cost. I think about this kind of theoretical diagram of cost versus benefits. At first, trees are small, so you need to protect them. They don't provide very many services. They don't provide any products. You have to protect them from the animals. And they cost money to plant and buy and all that. So there's a net cost at the beginning. There's some theoretical break-even point. And then from then on, we can expect that the benefits outweigh the costs. And I will argue that good design and good support moves this curve up and to the left to reduce the amount of time in the net cost section and accelerate the point at which it crosses over into net benefit. But don't think that you start out in the net benefit necessarily, like many things. So there's two sort of big pathways towards achieving silvopasture: planting trees into pasture and thinning the woods and adding grasses, and we'll talk about both of those. And as a variation on each of those, you can sort of feather or crenellate the edge, where on the left you see, I think this was thinning the woods and establishing grasses, just like a little bit into the woods, and the one on the right, they planted just some trees out from the edge of the wood line. So it doesn't have to be a field by field enterprise. Here's more pictures of feathering the edge. But for the category of planting trees in pasture, we're aiming for a mix of relatively widely spaced trees that grow well, allow for easy management, and they provide the benefits and other goals. And that's good because you can control what goes out there and how it's arranged, and the net carbon is better in the short term. But it's bad because you have to wait until the trees are useful. And so the trees spend 2, 3, 4 years as liabilities before they become assets. So there's this big question of how do you arrange trees? And there's no sort of one stock good answer. You have to balance this need that you need to protect the trees from animals, but you also want to keep most of the land in production. You need to be able to move your fencing and other infrastructure, and you want enough shade, but not too much shade. And so those are all somewhat competing elements when we're thinking about where do the trees go. You have to protect the baby trees if you don't want to fence off a whole area for 3 years. So you can protect them individually with physical fence, individually with electric fence, or in rows with electric fence. And there's a lot of creative ways to deal with that. I go back to my, excuse me for a sec, to my functional guardrail slide. Yeah, just to remember that when we're thinking about how do we arrange the trees, we also need to stay within these green parameters. I also think about this sort of sweet spot of how much shade do you want, right? It's to go before, enough to provide useful amounts of shade, but not so much shade that the grass doesn't grow well. We're sort of in that sweet spot. And if we think of this blue, if this compares time and amount of shade, if the blue is the sweet spot, there are a couple of different ways to get there. You could plant just a few trees, and it would be a long time before they gave you enough shade to be useful. But then you wouldn't have to mess with them after that. That would always sort of stay in a balance between the trees and the grass. Or you could plant a lot of trees, and you would get the correct amount of shade quickly, but then eventually you would get too much shade so that the grass started to decline in performance, at which point you would not have a very functional silvopasture, or you would need to thin the trees. And so I say this to sort of define the edges, the ends of planting strategies. And of course you could have any pathway in the middle, but just remember that to stay in this sweet spot of shade, there's either a trade-off of it takes longer to get there, or there's more management once you reach the high end of it. It's important to match the design of a silvopasture to all of these sort of other elements of the farm, right? The size of the animal herd, how fences and water get moved, how what trees grow well, what you want, the sort of amazing and inconvenient fact that trees grow and die, so they don't stay the same, and also just the risk and complexity of the more moving pieces there are, the harder they are to manage. And also remember that as livestock managers, we can change the timing, location, duration, and intensity of grazing. And for trees, when we're planting at least, we can control the species spacing, the pruning approach, and the density by cutting down some trees later. So those are all the things we can, those are all the like strings, the marionette strings we can pull to make this thing work. Here are some sort of templates for how to get there. These are not the only ways, but they're sort of good starting points. So you could do wide rows with flexible subdivisions. You pick a static width, and then you can subdivide in between that. So I said maybe 50 or 100 feet. It depends on the size of the animals and the kind of animals. So these are some examples of trees planted in rows. They're not necessarily subdivided in the ideal way, but this is what trees in rows can look like. There's some more, and I think I'm going to show a bunch of pictures. I'm not necessarily showing you that these are ideal silvopastures in every sense of the word, but showing you, in this case, this is what trees in rows look like. And you might think to yourself, oh, these are too dense for the thing I'm thinking about. Great, you could sort of take this picture and say, what if there was every other row of tree here, or what if these rows, rather than being whatever 40 feet apart, were 80 feet apart. So these are useful primarily as brainstorming, not as the platonic ideal of silvopasture. Here's some more rows. We can talk about this more later, but if you want your tree rows eventually closer together than your skinniest paddock, you can sort of block it up over time. You can plant half and then sort of shift halfway over. We can talk more about it at the end. You can plant trees in clusters like this. Oh, geez. This is another trees in clusters. This obviously doesn't distribute animal impact as well, but it can be easier to manage. You can have dispersed and irregular trees. I think about like a savanna or parkland, and there's like differences between those terms, but they all cover these dispersed irregular systems like this, like that. There's some other nice ones. Another variation on the wide rows is making hay or growing other crops in between the rows, which sort of pushes it into alley cropping or agro-silvopasture. But a lot of systems require, or they sort of mix grazing and haymaking, and so I'll talk about this more later. But you can sort of work backwards from, rather than saying, oh, will silvopasture work for me? I have 40-foot wide equipment. You would say, okay, this is the clearance I need for my equipment. This is how I use it. Let me design a silvopasture around that. So that's also an option. The other thing is that you might just want to start with trees on the edges. It's easier, but you get less of the sort of full benefits. So that's definitely on the table. The other pathway to silvopasture is thinning the woods and adding forages. And I will be careful here because there's a lot of ways to do this wrong and a lot of, sort of poor practice that gets called silvopasture, which I think raises a lot of people's hackles, often for good reason. So we'll say on the right site and with good management, if you reduce the tree cover to about half, and we talked before about half of what, it depends. In this case, I would definitely use the basal area measurement in addition to some of the others. And then you establish pasture and control the competing plants, whether that's resprouting trees or shrubs or other unpalatable things. So those are the sort of basic elements. So it might be appropriate when the site is well drained, it already has trees, and you can have your fencing and water infrastructure easily available. Or if it's already being used as a pastured woodland or a feedlot with trees on it, and it needs rehab. I saw this spot a bunch of years ago and thought, there's very little chance that making it a silvopasture would make things worse. So there's that. And forest conversion would be inappropriate if the site is wet or subject to compaction, if it's like healthy forest with good prospects for being managed as a forest. If it's too large to be grazed by the current number of animals, you're not likely to establish a good swath of forages when you're understocked. And if you're unable to have good infrastructure or good management. This is a forest conversion to silvopasture that I worked on a glacial outwash, very sandy, well-drained white pine site that got set stocked in like November through March, and so there wasn't the correct grazing management. And then you see the quality of the grass is not great. But it's a worthwhile discussion. Does forest conversion to silvopasture make things good? Does it make them less bad, or does it make things bad? And I think that's a worthwhile question to ask when considering any project, because I think there are silvopasture can fit into any of these categories. But it's important, I guess, to distinguish. Like I'm not over here saying, oh yeah, if you've got like a nice sort of sugar maple cove forest with ginseng in the understory and a super high site index, I'd say the burden of proof is on conversion to silvopasture, because it seems like that wouldn't be a good idea. But if someone's gonna clear the land and graze it anyway, or if someone is already putting cows in the woods, I think of forest conversion to silvopasture as like a way of reducing that harm. So I think of it as a tool that can be justified, though I think the burden of justification is higher than with planting trees into pasture. Here are some nice pictures of thinning the woods. And again, with elements of this, I wouldn't say, yeah, you should do the grazing management of this picture on the right, but tree selection and spacing look pretty good. Here's a couple more. Here's a couple more. This loblolly pine plantation on the left, I went to a field day in Virginia. It was 95 degrees in the sun, and it was 75 degrees in the silvopasture. And I felt it, and I said, oh, you know what? I should take the silvopasture thing seriously. Important things to think about: you got to pick the right trees, and you should have a forester help with those decisions. That's their bread and butter. Picking which trees stay and which trees go. If you harvest in the summer on relatively dry soil, to expose mineral soil so that you can fall seed, fall germinate, and be ready to go in the spring. And as I said, have enough animals ready to go in the following year. All right, so for silvopasture, there are a lot of, I think, valid reasons to say, yeah, but, and so there's these kind of critical questions that some people have, and I'll come up with ways to address that. Before I go into this next phase, are there any questions? And I see one in the chat, which I'll address. You referred to winter set stocking and its inappropriateness. Explain what that is and why it's inappropriate. I mean, non-rotational grazing. So particularly in times where the soil is wet, the animals are able to compact and eat down the grasses without giving them a chance to regrow. I mentioned that yield may or may not be affected by silvopasture. Can you speak to the total land use needed for silvopasture versus conventional pasture? Interesting question. Is more land generally needed for silvopasture? To the extent that forage productivity is lower in a silvopasture than in open pasture on like a volume basis, yes. But I think like on as a blanket statement, I don't think there's like consistent good evidence that silvopasture grasses are less productive than an open pasture. So you sort of have to I mean, I hate to say it depends 100 times, but it depends. And also, sometimes the forages are less productive, but more digestible. So the sort of overall animal performance is not necessarily different. Oh, good, thanks, yes. If more folks were to adopt silvopasture, would it result in more land use, thinking about deforestation and climate change? Yes, if you're just comparing if people do forest conversion to silvopasture versus if they manage their woods to be woods. Yeah, there's certainly the the net carbon benefit is lower for converting to silvopasture. I think there are cases where someone is not going to do kind of optimal forest management for forestry purposes, and so if silvopasture is a way to get them engaged with either managing invasives or sort of managing their overstory, or, managing the woods in general, rather than sort of neglect or maybe parcelization or whatever else, or as I mentioned, the sort of poor winter or poor grazing practices in the woods in general, the ideal is not an option, right? So to some degree, it's how do I put this, right? Like the least worst option, or another option when, if the ideal is that we all, whatever, yeah, you got what I'm saying. This question is 30% shade the target for most lands. That seems fair. How do you measure it? So like, sure, theoretically, in this 30, 40, 50% by eyeballing it, and, refer to that functional guardrails slide of like, there's not just one way to measure, and what's more important is well-distributed shade and animal impact and good grass growth. And so, yeah, I think it'd be cool. It'd be cool if we brought densitometers out and sort of got that measurement, but it's easier. I think like, I don't want people to say, oh, I don't have a densitometer, I can't assess whether this is enough shade, right? So sort of the in the field impacts of it. Okay, we'll get back into questions going on, and I will just say there will come a point in the next maybe half hour where I've got to take like a 5-minute break, so I'll just say that and then come back. Okay. How can I be sure these trees won't make my life harder? Trees get in the way and they fall down when you don't want them. So good design incorporates the equipment use and other layout needs. So here's some examples of trees in nice straight rows that accommodate pretty wide equipment. This, I think, is a 75-foot sprayer in between rows of trees. And I guess, let me just say, you have to drive slower in this situation. It's not a no trade-offs situation. So there is like a labor efficiency decline here, but it's still possible. You might say, oh, well, grass doesn't grow as well in the shade, particularly people looking at like the edges of their pastures and saying, well, it doesn't grow as well there than in the middle. And this point of, if it's too shady to grow grass, you need less shade. I'm not saying that all shade is good. And I refer you back to that same chart as before. Some shade, but not full shade. You might also say, oh, grass doesn't grow as well in the shade, looking at a single tree in the pasture that is concentrating animals and their impact underneath, or in the context of less than very good rotational grazing. So that can also affect how it seems like the grass is growing. But of course, how many trees do you need? You need more than one. I was on vacation in Colorado this fall, and I couldn't help taking a picture of these cows clustered under the single bunch of trees. So I was saying that if you have too few trees, it'll concentrate the animal's impact. And this is not to say that you should, like, it's not useful to have single trees, but you don't get the same animal impact distribution benefits as with better distributed trees. Single trees concentrate animals, which we've talked about with the effects that you can see. Here's some more. If it's too shady, it's not going to go well. Oh, hang on just a sec. Here's an example. When I lived in Philly, I saw this example on the left of well-distributed shade on the sidewalk, and then clustered shade at the Comcast Center for people eating lunch. So that also clusters the animal impact. At this point, Oh, and I'll get into this after we take a break. I got to take a 5-minute break, and I will rejoin the Zoom shortly and proceed, if that's all right.
That sounds great. We'll be here.
Great. Okay. Thanks a lot.
All right, folks, if everybody wants to take a quick 5-minute break and then come back, that would be great. We will be here.
All right.
Yes, we can. Thanks so much.
Cool. Thanks for rolling with the punches here. Let's get back into it. All right, you can see my slides again?
Yes, we can.
Great. I'm going to show some examples that I found of needing to accommodate equipment and trees. And I thought, oh, what better way than sort of using Google Maps to find Walmart parking lots and see how did they arrange their trees, and we'll see if they fit into some of these patterns that we've talked about. So I think this is maybe a Home Depot. Here you've got rows of trees and also some scattered trees. This one looks like a couple of nice wide rows with widely spaced trees on the end. This is a Hannaford near me, and this is just a nice simple grid. This is the mall in Poughkeepsie, and they've got these sort of wide parallel rows moving, and then a zoomed in portion of a modified grid. So basically, they've sort of worked around, okay, what sort of turning radius do we need? How much parking space do we need? And because trees are nice and keep things cool and you know, filter the storm water, we also want them there, but they were working backwards from their equipment needs. So we can do the same thing on farms. Great, I've showed you these similar pictures, though they'll damage the trees if you don't rotate them. And so there's also the element of the management as well as picking the right trees and putting them in the right space. You might think, oh, it's going to take a long time before these trees are useful. With good care and good establishment, I got 12 feet from black locust and hybrid poplar and others. So that requires early weed management and you know, fertilizing and making sure the trees have enough water, but it's not out of the question to have like functional sized trees by the 3rd year. You might say, oh, it's going to make moving fences difficult. I got to move Electronet twice a day. Sure, design around that. You know, make your rows 82 or 164 feet apart and kind of work backwards from there. And I think this wide rows with flexible subdivisions is one way to address that. Right, this note, of course, that cows will eat the bark if they get hungry, and that's a big if. Move them before they get hungry, or don't let them have access to the trees until the bark is thick enough. And I know that like everyone has the animal on their farm that can beat silvopasture, right? Everyone has, oh, the goats ate the bark in a 3-hour rotation of 100-year-old sugar maple, or whatever. And sure, I'm not here to tell you how your animals act, but I would just say, like, make sure you've exhausted all of the levers that we can pull, particularly including, good grazing, which involves good rotation, thinking about stocking density and rotation times and other available feed resources and all that stuff, before sort of writing it off. Although there will be the exceptions. The animals haven't seen this presentation, so they don't know. And I would say just don't bet the farm on any single tree. Sort of build in that risk into the system. Yeah. Here's some more examples of trees in nice straight rows that allow fencing and equipment to move around easily. The other thing is that it's complicated, and that's true. So because we want people to succeed with this, we start with smaller acreage, fewer species, straighter lines, and fewer decisions. And then can always, if we're going through NRCS and using equip, we establish it to the practice standards, and then can always enhance later using CSP. And I think even outside of the NRCS context, starting small, getting success, learning how these things work, and then scaling up from there makes sense. At Interlace Commons, we go through a kind of formalized systematic design process or planning process that involves, in part at least, an initial conversation, a farm narrative where people lay out their goals, site visits, site assessment, concept plans, and then a final planting plan. And those sort of help us match what people want, what's possible on the site, and then how these things can be arranged to meet these various goals. Another interesting layer, and I see we are, I know we are short on time, thanks in part to me, but let's see if I can get this to work. And if I can't, that makes things easier. Oh, geez, it was a real cute video of cows and sheep eating the leaves directly off of trees that were kept low. Here we go. These are some steers eating mulberry. So we know that tree leaves are palatable. Here they are eating black locust. And I took these videos when I didn't know I'd be using them in a presentation 5 years later. So I'm sort of oohing and eyeing at them. Oh, good job, you guys. So in part, we know that tree leaves are palatable. Although it's complicated, here I've got sheep with 2 different willow varieties, and they have fully eaten the variety on the left, SB1, and not touched any of the leaves on this SX61 on the right. So palatability is complex, as anyone who works with animals knows. We know that tree leaves can be nutritious, and we can subject them to any of the same kind of forage quality testing that we do with grass. And in a lot of cases, it is comparable, both in volume and in quality. And we also know that tree leaves grow well in July and August. And I think this is one of the key, one of the most exciting parts of this is you can see here, the grass is brown and the tree leaves are green. And this is in order from left to right, it's black locust, hackberry, and willow. And so I had a small herd of dairy sheep on this farm that I had designed around this tree fodder idea. And we were able to push the animals in paddocks that were otherwise run out of grass. We sort of got through the drought of 2022 using these trees as a resource. Let's see if these work. This is a black locust, and you can see the very clear browse line. They ate everything they could reach, and there was still some left over on top for shade or for me to come and cut down later to feed to them. And then this looks like mulberry. Yeah, and they're hanging out in the shade, having eaten mulberry leaves. Much like grass, or at least similar to grasses, tree leaves will regrow after some disturbances, like with grass management, with the right timing, duration, and intensity of disturbance, and then the appropriate amount of rest afterwards, we can subject trees to that same sort of cycle of disturbance and rest, and then disturbance again. So this is mulberry, black locust, and willow resprouting. We've got models for a system like this. This is a Lucina, which is a tropical legume in Australia. They've got huge swaths of grazing land planted out with this shrub for cattle feed. On the right, this is in Colombia, where they've been doing a bunch of work on systems like this. This is in Mexico with a version of Tithonia, like you grow in your garden, managed for sheep feed. And this is that same Tithonia plant in a sort of multi-story system in Colombia. But of course, they've been researching this in the tropics for the last 40 or 50 years. We're many decades behind them in developing this system. And we've got different grass species. Our cool season grasses are more nutritious than their grasses. We don't have as much sunlight. There's a lot of different things, but there are exciting ways of figuring out this sort of little component of silvopasture systems here in the Northeast. So I want to do a little bit of audience participation here. I Googled silvopasture. I Google image searched silvopasture, and I just screenshotted whatever came up. And I want you guys to look at these next pictures and tell me what you think. Kind of given everything that I've talked about and everything what are some good things about the silvopasture, and what are some things that could be revised? Let's get to it. What do you think about that? Oh. And you can either jump in or put it in the chat if that is logistically easier in a big group, but I just need one or two things per. Too much shade, yeah, good. Yep, toxic plants. People are seeing that, great. What about this one? Yeah, right, you can't see a fence, so I don't know about their grazing management, and the grass looks short at least, if not overgrazed. Yeah, and I would say this is like a decent balance between the row of trees and the shady grass. It looks like the trees are pretty dense, and the shade is not super well distributed. It's like this sort of dense cluster. You can see the accumulated pine needles under that. So I would say it's like fine. Though that row of trees is probably due for a thinning, but overall not terrible. Right, and the point of pine maybe not facilitating the best pasture growth. Although I will say in the Southeast, the loblolly pine plantation being thinned to establish grazing with the forage species that are available down there is one of the more widespread systems in the U.S. But good points. What do you think about this one? This looks like a forest conversion to silvopasture. Right, there's no animals, so it does, I guess, fail the 3-point test. Although we might say if the third test is rotating animals, maybe this is just at the end of a time when they've been rotated out. Yeah, right. A nice mix of shade and sun and healthy forage. I have no notes on this. It looks great to me. The trees are well spaced. The shade is well distributed. The grass looks good. I'm all in on this one. What about this? I believe this is from somewhere more tropical than us. Yeah, overgrazed. And if it was here at this latitude, I would say the trees are maybe too dense. It looks like a lot of trees. I assume it's tropical, so they got a higher sun angle, so it might be justifiable for them. But yes, grazing management, C minus. This was a forest conversion to silvopasture after 2 years, two years after establishment. What is wrong with this picture? Yeah, that's the big one. It fails the first point of the 3-point test. No grass. And it may be that, I think this one's in Florida. Those might be loblolly or shortleaf pine or something. Yeah, right. Needs a soil test. It might be a problem with the soil itself, or it might just be a problem with the timing of the seeding, or they didn't scarify the soil enough, or something. But I wouldn't feel great either calling this silvopasture or saying, hey, this might be a good idea if it looks like that. So you need more grass. And of course, this is not to like shake my finger at people trying interesting and innovative things. You know, of course, everyone's going to screw up, often for reasons outside of their control. But I think being able to look at this and recognize this is not the silvopasture that you read about. You know, this is when people say, oh, silvopasture can have all these benefits. This is not the one that we're talking about, but it could. This is just to like let you know this is what needs to be fixed here. What about this one? And I went to Yale. This is on a Yale website. I'm embarrassed by this. Yeah, one tree, too few. And of course you even see the sort of mud in the bottom right. What about this one? Yeah, right. Yeah, on the prior one, poor animal distribution. Good or bad in here? What do you see? Yeah, I see good balance. I assume of trees and grass and cattle. Yeah, lack of tree diversity. That's one thing. I believe this is like a southern pine ecosystem where that level of, you know, it might just be pine or it might be a converted plantation or something. But yeah, that's certainly an element to think about. It meets the 3-point test and not overgrazed, at least for some species. Yes. I would say for the animal group of this size, the subdivision seems too big. So I would sort of raise an eyebrow at the grazing management, although understocked is not as terrible as overstocked, right? So like it's there, it's on its way. I might say there's too many trees, but again, that depends on how the grass grows. So in summary, there are a lot of ways to make this work, but also a lot of variables. And so it's hard to say like this is the one best way. And so I hope I've laid out these kind of important guardrails, but also defined the fact that there is flexibility within them. And in some ways people say like, oh, how do you do silvopasture? And I say, oh, it depends. Here are the functional guardrails. It's sort of annoying, and people are just like, tell me what to do. But I think that's also kind of good, or it's kind of exciting in that we can take these general principles, and because of course farms and farmers and landscapes are also different, we can, if we sort of apply these general principles to these different sites, then we can come up with some interesting and exciting systems. As I suggested before, it's better to start small, learn lessons, and expand from there. There's this point that Brett Chedzoy and Peter Smallage make in a document they put out a bunch of years ago, that no one can be expected to know everything they need to know when starting out. And I think especially with this, basically, you got to be a forester, you got to be a good grazer, and you got to be a sort of forage agronomist, all at the same time. And that's a lot to ask of any one person, particularly if they are experts in anything else also, right? So it's fair to assume that coming up with ways to design and manage silvopastures will sort of necessarily involve more people, and that's fine. But they make this point: experiment and start small, but above all, start and make your mistakes in palatable and affordable places first to be able to develop things going forward. Thanks, and I think we've got a bunch of good time for questions here or discussion or anything else that I'm happy to take.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Eli, and thanks for being still willing to join us with the hectic day you're having. Very much appreciated. Please, folks, toss questions in the chat or come off mute. I'll get the things started. I was wondering if there are considerations for different like hill slopes or on contour planting of trees, if those are things you guys consider.
That's a good question. Sometimes, or like we always consider it, whether or not it affects the ultimate sort of decision of things. Kind of depends. Obviously for hills that are erosion risks, where like things are, where the status quo is not okay, right? Where well-managed perennial grass cover is not adequate. Oh no.
You still there?
I am. Can you hear me?
We can hear you, yes.
Okay. But it looks like my slides left. Anyway, sure. The contour thing, I think, especially if it was like an alley cropping system where there was some soil disturbance involved, or whether if the grazing management was such that the grass layer was not doing an adequate job, that's one consideration. Yes. Yeah, but also to the extent that trees will influence how the animals distribute themselves. I guess there's different directions to come at the problem of erosion on a hill slope, and it could be with tree layout and spacing, or it could be other elements of managing the whole system. That sort of answer the question.
That works, yeah. We have another question for you from Meanda. I see a lot of these trees. I see a lot of these have trees that are all a similar age. Curious about the importance of a variety of ages of trees. Is it important to have younger trees coming up as mature trees age to keep the shade grass tree balance? Yeah, I guess I'll pause there.
Yeah. To answer your yes or no question, yes, it is important to have, as a forester, I would say, a diversity of age classes on the landscape at a landscape scale. Whether or not that makes sense or is advisable or is beneficial, like within a field scale, I think is a separate question. It certainly makes things more difficult. So yes, a lot of the pictures that we saw were in the forestry world, we would call them even-aged. They were under even-aged management. I think that's the slide where I was talking about like the trade-offs of decision making and complexity. There's an argument for there's already so much going on when you're managing trees, grass, and rotating animals with a person involved that that it might be the thing that makes the system work to keep it relatively simple as far as age classes go. But I think also you just sort of put that through the test of what are the landowner goals, what's possible on the site, and what sort of time and effort and expertise do they have to manage it. So it's not that I'm saying no, you can't have more than one age class. I think as long as you figure out, how do you protect the younger age class of trees? How do you manage harvests? All that other stuff. One sort of interesting progression might be planting trees relatively densely, planting some of these trees where livestock can eat the leaves, and then when it comes time to thin, you cut down those trees and have them resprout, and the animals will eat those leaves. And then I think from a biodiversity or ecosystem services or forest resilience perspective, any of those, you could think about diversity. You call it horizontal diversity, right? Like diversity in between parcels. So you would have a 50-year-old stand next to a 10-year-old stand, so that the kinds of animals that rely on these different ages of trees can sort of bounce between habitat rather than having all of the habitat elements in a single stand. Is that satisfactory? Yep. Yeah.
We'll assume that it is. Thank you. Oh yeah, we are told that it was, so thank you.
Very good.
I know we talked a little bit about like how to choose the right tree, but are there certain forages that work better than others in a silvopasture system?
Yes. Most people, or at least most people that we have worked with so far, are kind of working with what they've got. Your sort of standard northeastern mix of cool season grasses and legumes and weeds. Generally, yes, cool season grasses are much better adapted to part shade conditions than warm season grasses. Although I think it's worth sort of figuring out what the edge of that is. You'd need a relatively not dense stand. How could you have 10 trees per acre with a big blue stem meadow or something like that? It's not to say it's impossible, but yes, cool season grasses. A lot of the research is on orchard grass, some on timothy, some on fescue, especially kind of farther down south, where they've got the toxic endophyte infected fescue, which affects animals' internal temperatures. There's research on silvopasture to mitigate heat stress that's exacerbated by the fescue toxicosis. So I think that's kind of a cool layer. I don't know if you were starting from scratch. There's some research, but not a huge amount of research for sort of our northeastern climate forage species.
Thanks. And yeah, folks keep putting questions in the chat. One thing I think people might be thinking about is the fungal connection underground from trees. And if you could just speak maybe a little bit towards that and how that impacts forage or not.
I would love to read the paper on that, or talk to the person who's doing a PhD on that. I don't know. We might assume that landscapes with some scattered trees have different, at least, fungal connections than those that don't. And you might expect, okay, that might contribute better to nutrient cycling or to, soil characteristics or infiltration capacity or any of that other stuff. But I don't know for sure. And I would imagine that that would always be a secondary consideration, right? Like you wouldn't design a silvopasture with the goal of a fungal community. Maybe you would. That could be cool. But I feel like that's a sort of means to an end or a sort of interesting byproduct. But I think because of that, it is sort of less explicitly studied than some of this other stuff.
Fair enough. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit more about the cluster arrangement. I feels like a lot of the images we saw were linear, and I'm wondering when a cluster arrangement would be appropriate and how do you control the animals from not just hanging out there.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one is a trade-off in some part between like aesthetics. You know, some people don't like the look, or it doesn't work for them operationally to have the big wide straight rows, especially on like very hilly or irregularly shaped parcels. You know, so a lot of this research is in places where they farm on flat rectangles, which is not a lot of our farms here. To the question of how do you stop them from clustering, yeah, I think it's just like kind of more serious management, or you might say that the cluster itself has this has the trees well spaced enough. You know, so you might have like a cluster of 10 or 12 or 15 trees that are not like super dense like a forest where it's super shady underneath, but you might just have like a little patch of what we would call or think of as the sort of silvopasture that meets the 3-point test. But yeah, I think it just would be subject to, got to be careful of the grazing management and you know, move them when there's no grass. I know I was working with someone recently where they had these like pretty dramatic like little ridges and valleys in one of the main pastures, and they were talking about how you know the grass grows fine in the valleys, but it's super dry on the ridge tops. And could we just put little clusters of trees on the ridge top? So it might also be like if the landscape doesn't lend itself to straight lines, and if the landscape kind of suggests these little pockets that are not super productive now, those are good places to start. But I'm happy to hear that question because it reflects this concern about like how does the tree arrangement affect how the animals cluster? And yes, that is something to work around. So I'm happy to hear that question.
Wonderful. And then this is less of a question, more of a comment from Willie. All cool season plants, C3, want cooler temps than we have for summer months, various tolerances and responses to shading. But at some point along the edge of any woods, the grasses actually grow better than in midfield. I don't know if you want to respond to that or ask another question.
Yeah, no, I'll accept that as the premise.
Wonderful. I guess I was just wondering if you could speak a little bit to your experience with Interlace and kind of the scale of the work you all are doing. How are things going? Do you have a lot of projects? Just kind of get a feel for where the workload is there.
Yeah. Yeah, we've got a lot of work. One of the big projects is this cooperative agreement with Vermont NRCS, where some of the technical assistance that Vermont landowners or land managers are seeking from NRCS, the agroforestry technical assistance, Interlace Commons is providing that in conjunction with some of the NRCS planners. So we've got a cohort of people in that program. We just started. We're involved in a couple of these partnerships for climate smart commodities grants that came out last year and have sort of slowly been rolling out throughout the year. Let's see. There's yeah, and you know some fee for service, and so we do a lot of work in Vermont. There's another grant that sent us between New Hampshire, Massachusetts, and Vermont, where we did a couple of alley cropping projects, a couple of silvopasture projects, and a couple of forest farming projects. So a lot of it is kind of whichever grant we're working under has their parameters, whether it's focusing on certain practices or certain geographical areas. But I would say we're in a phase of like a bunch of work is coming our way, and we're working on systems to like systematize decisions and systematize communication and like get together our educational and introductory materials for these kinds of things. And I think that's still an area of active work. I'm thinking about like, there's this sort of like ladder of both enthusiasm and understanding and practice that people can get on, and I think if we start people on, like how does soil microbiology change at different tree density? Like there's some of this stuff is really cool, and it's not the first thing you need to know. So I think it's an area of active interest and pursuit to like scaffold all of this stuff in a way that makes sense. But both to like make it easier for me to communicate it well, and make it easier for other people to receive it and put it into practice well.
It's kind of on that thread of thinking for folks that are in this room right now, who have producers who are interested in agroforestry or silvopasture, any of the various multitude of names, what should they do as a next step? Yeah,
good question. I will take this as an opportunity to plug two of the books that Interlace Commons is writing. One is a manual on tree hay and tree fodder, so the tree leaves to feed livestock. That's gonna be a beast, sort of taking research from all over the world and making recommendations for management in the temperate world. And then also a manual on alley cropping, so rows of trees with crops growing in between. But that's not all the resources, and that's not all the next steps. Yeah, I mean, I think let's see. I think like in the absence of like, you should call us and have us talk to you. What feels important is like getting producers to articulate their goals clearly, and sort of getting people on the good grazing train before they get on the silvopasture train. And it might be that people are more interested in silvopasture. Silvopasture is sort of having a moment now, and there's money around for it, and so that might be the thing that's driving people's interest. But you might go and say like, based on what I see and know about someone's grazing practices, if they planted a bunch of trees, they would probably, be half dead in 10 years. So I think like making sure that the fundamentals of like clear goal articulation and good grazing, and like getting people's risk tolerance, getting people to articulate their risk tolerance, and I think like the working backwards from the rest of the operation, rather than saying, what is silvopasture? And getting people to decide, is this for me or is this not for me? But more saying, how, given my constraints and goals, what is the silvopasture that I can design to make it work for me? But I think it's a good question, and there's a need for I don't know if people are familiar with like the University of Missouri's technical manual for agroforestry design. They put out a bunch of years ago. I like that as a model. It's sort of like it leads landowners and planners through this design process. I think that could be something worthwhile here. Yeah, I don't know. And I guess one more thing to add is that a component of a lot of the grants that we're working on, and I think something that we as either land managers or resource, natural resource professionals share, is like, it's way easier to have these conversations when you're standing in a field. And it's especially interesting to have the silvopasture conversation in the summer when you go stand in a hot field and then go stand in the cool silvopasture. But like the more that we can sort of take the knowledge, right now this is very much like I've done the research and I'm dispensing it to you, dispensing these ideas. But it's way more powerful, of course, when people are actually doing this stuff and they can say, here's what worked for me and here's what doesn't. Here's what the book said, but here's what I did, and here's my take. So I think just the more we get people on each other's farms, even in the early stages. Like it's super useful to go to someone's farm the year after they planted trees and have them say, this is what I liked and this is what I didn't like about the establishment phase. Even if we're not waiting 20 years for them to say, oh yes, my average pasture productivity was 10% higher in my silvopasture over the last 20 years than in the open pastures, right? Like, yeah, incomplete knowledge and experience is still useful. So I think the more you can sort of get people discussing things, discussing the parts of this, the more useful it is.
Thanks. Yeah. And Willie in the chat also said your slides gave a lot of good guidance questions, much like how to decide what to do about cover crops or possible relay cropping. What are goals, resources, functions desired, results desired, and one amount of time to fit what other activities, functions, and tools, etc. He really liked your answer. And I guess I'll build onto that a little bit too. It kind of sounds like your answer for now is also just like keep building those relationships with the farmers and really understanding what their goals are and helping them come up with their goals and whether or not agroforestry kind of fits into that.
Yeah.
And more information too.
Oh yes,
sorry,
and then there was a request. You mentioned 2 books. It sounds like you're still writing. When they are available, where will those books be available?
We will promote the hell out of them. You'll know. I don't know yet. Yeah, you know, if for now, if you're on Instagram, you can follow Interlace Commons on Instagram. We don't have a like email newsletter yet, but we'll certainly sort of push it out through all the channels. It's either going to be later this year or next year, so it's not imminent.
Awesome.
Yeah. Oh shoot, there's one other thing I wanted to say. I appreciated the comparison to cover crops, and I feel like agroforestry has a chance to be where cover cropping is in 20 or 30 years. You know, like the way that cover cropping as a set of strategies has developed has been really cool, and with this balance of like off the shelf formulas and sort of nuanced design stuff. I will say, I think there is a danger of overselling agroforestry and silvopasture, or I guess it's something I'm thinking about. Of like, how do we talk about this very cool and exciting and promising thing with that has a lot of good evidence behind it, but not say, oh, you know what, this is the silver bullet, or this is automatically better than everything else, or any of that stuff. So I think it's just like going in with a clear head and saying like, this is agroforestry includes a bunch of tools that we can have in our toolbox, and we still have to justify their use, and we still have to sort of understand the limitations of what's possible. So be open to all of that, and come at it sort of little c conservatively, while still being excited about it. I love this stuff. It's super exciting, and I think it serves it well and serves the project of natural resources management well if we sort of go in moderately.
Thanks, Eli. One more comment from Willie, just letting everyone know that the White River NRCD has a Dairy Business Innovation Center cohort with one goal of exploring agroforestry options for each farm involved. It's a bit of a partnership with Dartmouth Agroforestry, and so we're learning here in Vermont. We need to make this training to propel a higher grade sharing communications. So yeah, I think the more people who are involved, the better the ideas will be, and the more information we can gather. I really want to thank you,
Totally,
Eli.
that's a good.
Oops, sorry, go ahead.
Oh sure, yeah, I'm happy to be there, and I thank you to Willie for bringing that up. There's also TNC is running a Partnerships for Climate Smart Commodities grant that involves agroforestry. I know Wolf's Neck Center has one. American Farmland Trust, of course, has their Connecticut River Valley agroforestry and grazing work. So there's a lot of I'll say Interlace is by no means the only people doing this work. I think we do it well and have good stuff to say, and so do a lot of other people. So yeah. Especially given where agroforestry is, it's super useful, and especially as we as service providers and as landowners are navigating this like big influx of federal money that's going towards agroforestry over the next 3 or 4 years, especially, the more we can sort of all be talking about how to make it work, the smoother I think it will go. So yeah, thanks everyone for your attention and for being flexible with all of the audio visual stuff, and I appreciate your questions and attention and enthusiasm. And I'll say, feel free to email me, eli@interlacecommons.org. I'm happy to chat about any of this stuff at any point.
Awesome. Thank you, Eli. And then just to wrap up the day, like usual, folks, here's your homework for next time. Our next class will be a week from today on Tuesday, February 13th from 2 to 4 p.m. We will have Joshua Faulkner talking about managing for water and soil structure. There is a good bit of reading. I know last week was also a good bit of reading, but it's chapters 14, 15, and 17 in Building Soils for Better Crops. So please do take a look, come prepared to that event as well. And yeah, maybe everybody will start to look at the trees around them a little bit differently after today. I know I will. With that, I hope everyone has a great rest of your day. Oh, and thank you, Mel. Please fill out the webinar evaluation form Mel tossed in the chat. And Lindsay says that the chapters for homework are great and they go by quick. So thank you, Lindsay, and thank you, Lindsay, for all of your excellent contributions of content today. So we'll see everyone in a week. And once again, thank you, Eli, for making the space to have this conversation with us.